My namaskarams to all. Respected Manojji Sontalia, respected Archana Prasad Madam, my respected colleagues in the MOP Board of Governors, my eminent friends Professor Sriram, Madhusudan, and my dear students. I am very embarrassed to be the target of all that has gone on in the last 1 hour. Anyway, but it's an honor to be speaking on this occasion. Sri S. Padsarthi, whose birthday happens to be today, has been one of the founders of this college. And he has contributed immensely to the stature, academic, popular, and multifarious sort of levels in which this college has distinguished himself. He has been one person who has contributed immensely, and he passed away just 4 years ago when he was 104, and he was very actively associated with every activity of this college till more or less his last days. And more than myself, he was the person who used to travel by bus in his 101st or 102nd year and come here and be in all functions and make suggestions. And I think it's very good we remember him. But we can also remember him as a very great thinker and academic. He was one of the most well-known information and library scientists of the country, one of the premier students of Sri S.R. Ranganathan, who is well known as a doyen of library science in 20th century. And he set up the famous institution called Indian National Science Documentation Center, INSDOC. Now I think it's called Indian National Research Service Center, something like that. And he was its director. And after his retirement, for nearly 30, 40 years, he sort of worked on library science and information science. And he set up a Ranganathan Institute for Research, which I think still carries on. And one very crucial quality about him was his continued curiosity about everything. And a strategic sort of a mind which could go into any subject and see what is going on in the world, what people are doing, what we should be doing in India. These are the kind of issues that and what we should be doing as a college or as a community. Everywhere he had this quest, and he was a role model for all of us. So it's an honor to be speaking on this occasion. I'll say something on Indian knowledge traditions, Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, its past, present, and future. It may sound a little bit academic topic away from what you know, but maybe if you sort of carefully follow what I'm saying, you will get something out of it. So in the beginning, I will just summarize what I have sort of understood by study of Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. So one is, what is this parampara? So this includes all systematized disciplines of knowledge, which were developed to a very high degree of sophistication in India from very ancient times. And all the traditions and practices of our communities, including the tribal communities, they have evolved and refined and preserved over generations. And today's historical studies show that they were flourishing in varied spheres of our national activity from the Vedic period, and they were really flourishing till the early decades of 19th century. They were based upon the foundational civilizational values and ideas of our civilization, especially on our understanding of the oneness of the entire creation. Now, they were actively practiced, taught, and developed, but they also contributed immensely to the prestige that India had all over the world. And they were also responsible for ensuring that India was a great economic power till early 19th century. Now, during the large historical sort of period that we are aware of, It is true that India did interact with various other cultures and civilizations. We would have borrowed lots of ideas, techniques, but they were all assimilated. Whatever was in consonance with our way of understanding the world were all assimilated and improved upon. So we continue to base as a base our own civilizational values till 2 centuries ago. But unfortunately, the study and practice of all our Jnana Parampara got disrupted very badly during the period of British rule, especially during the period of British rule, and particularly through the system of education that was implanted here, which made all of us thoroughly ignorant of what our Jnana Parampara has been. And now in the last 150 years, many distinguished Indian scholars have tried to revive, rediscover, or continue the tradition, but in spite of their tireless, meticulous, and very sort of serious efforts, we still cannot say that we have fully comprehended the methodologies, the fundamental philosophies, the possibilities that are there of our Jnana Parampara for the contemporary period. And now one serious reason of this lacuna, no society would say that we are not fully aware of our past. Why should they think so? Because of a certain historical circumstance that serious work on our Jnana Parampara has always become, even in the post-independence era, a matter of personal sort of journey or quest. And this has not acquired a systematic status in all our institutions of learning, in our schools, in our colleges, in our higher institutions of learning, etc. And that's because we don't teach it, we don't study it and teach courses on it, we don't do research on it. So there's a large corpus still which of not only texts, there are a whole lot of physical structures, material objects which need to be studied and researched upon. And this is a task which has to be undertaken on a priority basis in all our institutions of learning. And whatever we understand about our Jnana Parampara, how its evolution is, and what it has achieved in different systems, different aspects of our national life, and what we should teach to everybody, this should be the quest for the contemporary Indians. So this is some kind of the background that I think what I am trying to convey. Now I am going to just present you some facets of how this Jnana Parampara developed from ancient times till the recent times. So that will be the rest of the talk. So now the word Shastra was mentioned. Shastra means instruction. And the main thing about texts of different disciplines in India is that they do not present knowledge as a set of statements of truths or what is called propositions. They instead give you methodologies or systematic procedures to do particular things. So the word used in the text will be in Sanskrit, vidhi, kriya, prakriya, sadhana. So in Tamil today we have sort of coined the term padimurai, or for the word algorithm. It's something like that. I'll come to algorithm in a minute later. So this vidhi, kriya, prakriya, this is what Shastra teaches, how to systematically go about doing something. So even Gita talks about the Shastra vidhi. So each discipline, first of all, in traditional India, had its own purpose, which is declared right at the outset. And then it presents procedures for doing various things in that discipline. So if you go to Vyakarana, Ilakkanam in India, so it is called Shabdanushasana. And in fact, the purpose of grammar was to be able to derive all grammatically valid sentences, words, utterances. Similarly, mathematics is called in India Ganita, which in itself means calculation or computation. So it was doing calculations with numbers, figures, and things like that. That's the purpose of that discipline. So astronomy was called Kala Vidhana Shastra. Jyotisha, of course, it's called. So that is the method of determining time, location, and direction at any place. Location means longitude, latitude. But to do that, you need to observe the motion of celestial bodies. So this astronomy became a systematic science of understanding, observing and understanding the motion of celestial bodies. Similarly, the science of health or Ayurveda, the purpose is to preserve a healthy person's health from not getting disturbed and to restore the balance of an unhealthy person's into a more healthy situation. So these were very well-defined objectives that many of these famous classical disciplines set for themselves. I mean, you can look into any other older disciplines of India. There are these 18 Vidyas or 64 Kalas, etc. If you see any of their texts, they will very clearly specify what they are aiming to do. And while aiming to do that, they go on discussing various sets of methodologies in a very systematic manner. So going to grammar, again the old books will say, Prakriti Pratyaya Vibhagena, so derive words by using stems and prefixes and suffixes. You go on deriving words and through word sentences. And that's the purpose of grammar in all books. So how was this achieved in the very old grammar of Panini, 600 BCE or 500 BCE? It gives 4,000 rules. And that is appended with some other material. There are a list of 2,000 dhatus or verbal roots. And there are a list of already formed words called Ganapatha. Then there are a few other things. So Panini's 4,000 rules is like something what may be called as an expert system in modern computer science. A whole lot of programs all put together, which we do as humans to check how a word is derived from this dhatu with this pratyaya and things like that. And so using the sutras of Panini and these 2,000 dhatus, it's possible to not only generate all the valid utterances of Sanskrit language, but also of the deviant formations that are there in the Vedic corpus. Now, a modern world has recognized that this kind of methodology, where a set of rules are there, and then when you have a set of rules, what sequence they have to be put in, what rule takes a precedence over the other rule, all these things you will study in your computer programming today. So if you look at Panini, you will see how he has established all this and many things more. And this became the method for doing explaining systematic procedures in each of Indian disciplines. So this was very highly praised. This grammar was not only praised in India, this is a statement of Itzing, who comes to India in the end of 7th century. He studies Sanskrit, not in China, not in India. He goes to Sumatra. While coming to India, he is taking the sea route. So he studies Sanskrit language in Srivijaya, which is Sumatra, for 6 months, and then he comes to India. He refers to India as the celestial storehouse of knowledge. That is how India was known to Chinese in those times. And China is called the divine land. And then there's a great praise for Vyakarana of Panini, which he says he studied from Suri, that is somewhere in Uzbekistan, to Polo Condore, which is in Vietnam. So the entire swath of West to East Asia, this is where Panini's grammar is known. Similarly, once we go to the science of astronomy. Now, this is indeed an extraordinarily ancient science in India. Entire Vedic corpus has many statements which show the understanding of the motion of celestial bodies. But Vedas are not about motion of celestial bodies, but the Vedic Suktas will explain to you whatever is observed in the sky in a very systematic manner also. So there are various ancient texts, and much of our modern calendar comes from period at least 1000 to 1500 or even more before the Common Era. But there is some indication of how old the Vedic texts are. A very beautiful sort of indication that we can see, a very rigorous and beautiful illustration. We all know that Earth spins around its axis, and this axis of the Earth itself goes around. And it goes around the system of stars once in 26,000 years. So this is one of the extremely large periods. The Earth rotates in one day about its axis, but this axis itself goes around like a top when it stops. So this is called precession. And now if there is a star which is there when the Earth's axis is pointing to the sky, that will be called a Dhruvatara. We all know the story of Dhruva, that he became the center of sky about which the rest of the celestial bodies go around. So now the Indian text, the Vedic corpus, discusses, so this is the path of this Earth's axis amongst the stars. So if this is 0 of common era, this is minus 2,000, minus 4,000, minus 10,000. This is coming this way up to plus 14,000 of the common era. So you see there was no star at the point where the Earth's axis met the celestial sphere. So the north celestial pole had a star exactly around minus 2,800 years prior to the common era. And this constellation is called the Dragon constellation today. It was called Shinshumara in the Vedic text and later texts. And this star was called Abhaya-dhruva. And a Vedic text called Taittiriya Aranyaka has a description of this dhruva. Afterwards, you can see, there was sometimes some star near the north celestial pole, but it's only in our times that you have a star near the north celestial pole. You have a Dhruvatara for the past nearly 300 years, you can see that close to the north celestial pole. It's now called Polaris or Alpha Ursa Minoris. This is what is the Dhruvatara which navigators in 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century saw. And this will be exactly in the north celestial pole at 2100 after the common era. So, Indians have talked about this Dhruvatara and also the contemporary Dhruvatara. So this has been the history of astronomy in India. Now in mathematics, all of you know the place value system, that a number like 123 is written with 1, 2, 3, where 1 stands for 1 into 100, 2 stands for 2 into 10, and 3. So this has evolved in India over about 1,200, 2,000 years, from the Yajurveda Samhita, where everything is based in powers of 10. So there is a decimal way of naming numbers, much before the decimal place value system came. And then there is an idea of zero, which develops through Vyakarana and the Buddhist and Nyaya philosophies. And by the time of Pingala's Chanda Sutra, 300 years before the common era, a word for zero as a symbol, shunya, is there in Pingala's Chanda Sutra. And so this is around the time when this system is discussed. And all mathematics, the entire arithmetic that we teach in school is so simple because we use the decimal place value system, and entire arithmetic and even more other things are there in the Indian books of Aryabhatiya or of Brahmagupta, written in 499 and 628. Now, they were not only discovered here, they made arithmetic possible universally, that we could teach. Division was such a complicated thing without the place value system. Multiplication also is complicated, but even much more so is division. So this became very famous within a short while. And this is in around 622, a Syrian bishop is talking about the importance of the arithmetical calculations that Indians are able to do just with these 9 symbols and 0. And this is around 1000 AD, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he is also called in Latin. He is a great philosopher and a medical scholar. He learned Indian arithmetic from a vegetable seller. So this is the universalization of numeracy was made possible, and most of Asia got this decimal place value system. Europe got it much later, around 12th and 13th centuries, and the Roman sort of numerals slowly had to make their disappearance in mathematics by about 16th, 17th century only. Now, having found out the place value system, we wrote all our books in mathematics, in astronomy, in music, in poetry. So in poetry, you cannot go on saying 5,423 to denote a number, so you have to work out a scheme. So for that, we used the linguistic sort of coding. So in Sanskrit, this coding was done with the consonants, ka, kha, ga, ga, nga, cha, cha, ja, ja, nya, 1 to 9 and 0. So these consonants represent those numbers. Similarly, ta, tha, da, dha, na, ta, tha, da, da, na represent those numbers. Pa, pa, ba, ba, ma represents 1 to 5. Yara, lava, shasha, saha represent 1 to 8. All vowels represent 0. And if you have a conjunct consonant, the consonant near the vowel is the one to be taken. So with this scheme, they could write poetry, they could give formulae, everything could be done. But how about Tamil language? Tamil language does not have all these what are called the Vargiya Vyanjanas. It has only ka and na in terms of a symbol, and it also has the ga sound, but in terms of symbols, only you have ka and na. Similarly, cha, nya, ta, na, ta, na. So, but astronomy, mathematics was a homegrown discipline in Tamil Nadu from ancient times. So, we found a very beautiful system in Tamil also. So this was developed at least from 12th century, perhaps it's much older, that they started using the vowels, a, I, u, a, I, represent 1 to 9, and o, au represents 0. So it's very well found in a text called Chudamani Ullamudiyan, written in 13th century. Now there's something called the Chandravakyas. What do these Chandravakyas do? Moon has an elliptical orbit around the earth. The point where he is going slowest is called the Ucha or the apogee. So if moon and apogee are together on one day, what will be the exact longitude of the moon? How many degrees would moon have moved by the same time next day? So there are formulae for that. These formulae were written in Sanskrit using Katapayadi. Girnaha Shreyaha. So Ga is Kaka Ga 3, Irna, so Na is 0, Shra, second is Ra is 2, Ya is 1. So 12 degrees 3 minutes. You have to write them in the reverse order. 0 is the 0 Rashis. So like that, these are formulae, 248 formulae, through which you can remember the motion of the moon for 248 days, exact motion. And in Tamil, this Katapayadi was replaced by this, what is called the Uirelithu-based system, Vinnor Nathan. V is A, E 3, No, O is 0, Na is 2, Ta is 1. So this way, everything that was possible in Sanskrit was made possible in Tamil by this very ingenious system. So this was a very creative civilization all through. So in Chudamani Ullamudiyan, you have sort of complicated mathematical procedures, and all numbers are encoded within the words. So Mannan Veedu Shul Kulam will stand for 1565411, Palliyoni stands for 3031, etc. And in 2 verses, they are able to give the entire procedure for calculating the longitude of the moon for any day. And this Vakya system could be done using pure arithmetic, multiplication, division, finding the remainder or finding the quotient, and then multiplication with various given constants. And this was fairly accurate for Amavasya and Paurnima, when sun and moon are either in conjunction or in opposition. Now this health care was something that was more or less universal in India from ancient times. So Fahyan, who comes to India in 399 to 414, he is explaining that in every city there were houses for dispensing charity and medicine. All the poor and destitute in the country, orphans, childless men, maimed, cripples, all who have diseases, go to these houses. They are provided with every kind of help, and doctors examine their diseases. They get the food and medicine which their cases require and are made to feel at ease, and when they are better, they go home. And there is a very beautiful description of how hospitals should be in Charaka Samhita, which is a much more ancient text. So this is one of the most wonderful descriptions of hospital available in cities of India in 400. And now I come to near our place. So this is a place called Tirumukkudal. This is on the road between Chengalpet and Kanchipuram. And here is a temple built during Vir Rajendra, who is the son of Rajendra II. He is the third son. So in his time, a Veda Pathshala for 60 scholars and an Aturashala hospital with 15 beds he set up in this temple called the Appan Venkateshwara Swami temple. And this is the large inscription. This goes like about 20 feet and this way and 4 or 5 slabs. One of the longest inscriptions discussing both the Vedic Pathshala and the Aturashala are there. And one of the very interesting things here, I mean, amongst many others, is the kind of remuneration paid. The physician, Vaidya, is paid 90 kalam. 1 kalam is about 125 kgs of paddy. Surgeon who receives 30 kalams of paddy. 2 persons for fetching all medicinal herbs who get 60 kalams of paddy. 2 nurses who receive 30 kalams of paddy. A barber who received 15 kalam of paddy. And there is a waterman who receives 15 kalam. So this is the ratio between all the different functionaries in this temple. And there is a beautiful description of all the medicines that are stocked there. These are mostly well known in all the classical Sanskrit literature of Charaka Samhita, Ashtanga Hridaya, Yoga Ratnakara and all that. Each of these medicines are described, how much amount of various herbs are needed for this, etc. So this one of the kind of, there are about, maybe in Srirangam there is a similar inscription. There are various other places also, such inscriptions are there. Now by 9th century, we see this kind of temples built not only in India, but in Southeast Asia. This is one of the largest temples in Indonesia, the Trimurti temple in Prambanan. You would have seen photographs of this. So this is the great Angkor Wat temple, which is as large as the Vatican sort of area, and its largest religious monument, this built in 12th century, the Vishnu temple. So now by this period, 1068, India is very well known as a land of great knowledge. So here is Al-Andalusi. Andalus means Spain in Arabic. And he is explaining how India is known as the land of wisdom. And he is saying that in arithmetic, in geometry, in knowledge of stars, astronomy, and in knowledge of medical science, strength of various drugs, compounds. So in all this, India is very famous for its knowledge in all this. Now, around the same time, of course, we have this one of the first invasions of the Turco-Afghans. And Al-Biruni comes with them. So he is known for his book on India. This is a book which is usually called Indica, but its actual Arabic title is The Doctrines of the Indians, What is Reasonable and Not Reasonable Amongst Them. So that's the title of the book. I mean, he is a person who is looking at India very fairly, seriously from his point of view. And of course, he says several things. I just wanted to say that the sciences have retired from the parts which Mahmud of Ghazni sort of conquered. They have fled to Kashmir and Banaras. And then he says, Hindus believe that there is no country but theirs, no nation but theirs, no kings like this, no religion like this, no science like this. Something I don't think any Indian would today believe. But that was the kind of, say, overconfidence we had in our civilization then. Now we come to the later period, this what is called the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics, well known for Madhava, who sort of founded calculus by discovering infinite series and did some work in astronomy also. His student Parameshwara observed the skies over 55 years, and which made it possible for his son's student, Nilakanta Somyaji, who came up with a revised planetary model, which is essentially the kind of model which was proposed. He is proposing a planetary model in 1500. This is being proposed around 110 years later by Kepler. And it continues very well till 1650, but it goes on till 18th century. Now, these are some of the infinite series that Madhava wrote down. This first one is also rediscovered by Leibniz 300 years later. The second one is rediscovered by Abraham Shah, again 320 years later. And of course, we have this very beautiful series by Ramanujan, which is in the same line as this. And this series, incidentally, was used to calculate pi to 1 billion decimal places in 1980s. Ramanujan discovered it in 1914. So this is the statement of Nilakantha, that Mercury and Venus, their orbits do not circumscribe the Earth. That is the main point about heliocentric astronomy, that Jupiter, Mars and Saturn are farther away from the Sun than the Earth. So their orbits go around the Sun, their orbits go around the Earth also. But it is only Venus and Mercury which are lesser in distance from the Sun than the Earth. And if their orbits don't go around the Earth, it means that all the planets are going around the Sun. And then it says these planets are dragged around the Earth by the Sun. So this is something which was later called the model of Tycho Brahe, which Nilakantha is discovering. And he is discovering it by just observing that the up and down motion of all planets move in a plane which is inclined to the plane of Earth's orbit around the sun. So there is a period for going up and down with respect to the plane which is called the ecliptic. Then there is a period for going around. For planets which go around both the Earth and the sun, both these periods are the same. But for planets which do not go around the Earth, but go around the sun, these two periods are different. By looking at this is a very simple observational fact that he was able to come up with this. Okay, now I come to 18th century, modern India, pre-modern India. So in around 1750, South Asia, that is India of today, that was the India then till 1947. So this was the producer of a quarter of world's textiles, and it was an exporter of much larger quantity, that's maybe 35% of world textile trade, which was bought from India, mostly by Europeans then, and sold in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and America, and even in Europe. So about 30 years ago, a Belgian economist called Paul Bairoch estimated what is called the manufacturing output. As you all know in economics, there is an agricultural part of the GDP, there is a manufacturing part of GDP, and there is a services part. This is the manufacturing part of the GDP, and its share in the world's manufacture. So in 1750, China and India had about 56% of the world's manufacturing output. It came down, and it came down to about 4% in 1953 together. So this decline starts in India in 18th century itself. In China, it starts a bit later, about 50 years later, because China anyway was not colonized, but it was attacked with these opium wars, and then the entire area was surrounded by about 1820. So there's a decline in China also, and there's an increase in UK, as you can see. Now, Paul Bairoch showed this correlation very beautifully. Later on, a man called Angus Maddison, a British economist, has produced a different version of these tables because he didn't like this idea that the decline of India and China is correlated with the rise of modern West. That he wanted to say, he tried to show the ratios of this to be much larger even in the earlier period. Anyway, so but what is interesting is our current situation, that it has gone up, but it has not really gone up that significantly. Of course, there are many other countries which have started now increasing their share of the world's manufacturing output. But what you see here, that what China has tried to achieve in the last 25, 30 years, I don't think we have achieved anywhere near that. But we should remember, this is our historical legacy. This is our civilizational legacy, that this is what we have been capable of. Now, I will say something about this area around Chennai. So, on this area, there is extensive data about the villages. All aspects of the villages. These were written by what are called the Kanakapillais, the account keepers of the village. These are written in palm leaf. And when the British got this area around Chengalpet, it was given as a Jagir by the Nawab of Arcot, who was the successor of the Mughal rulers and later on the Nizam, etc. So this was given as Jagir, but Nawab was still not a very sort of deeply entrenched ruler. He was more a nominal ruler of the area. And this Jagir was given around 1764. And then the British undertook a survey of this area. And they got these accounts from the Kanakapillais also. And they found many, many interesting things. So first is this. These are the palm leaf manuscripts written by these Kanakapillais. This entire thing is one leaf, large uncut coconut palm leaf, written on both sides in some symbolic language, something like this. So this will be well known to people who know Tamil numbers. This is 17, I think this is 1772, it should be. Yes, this is 72. Nandana Varsham, October Masam, 7வது நாள், புரட்டாசி மாசம் 22வது engineer Bharnit, Rajashri, and it goes like that. Nanjai Kani, Nuru, Punjai Kani, Nanuti Eluthirandu, therefore Kani, Ainuti Eluthirandu, like that. So it's a very detailed account. So now, for instance, this village Ullavur, which again lies very close to the Chengalpet Kanchipuram road, near the Tirumukudal, there were 14 temples, there were 2 tangals, which are like aries, 2 kulams, which are dugout tanks, 14 Kuttai, which are not paved tanks. Then Maduvu are sort of places where water stops. And there are so many water bodies. So in all, they are about 9% of the land. Then temples are there, plantations are there, threshing grounds are there. Habitation is only about 4% of the land. Cultivated land is about 48%. So this Ullavur somewhere here, the Palar river is here. But what is interesting about this map is all these blue. This is a survey of India map in 1750s. This is not a 18th century map. So this area is called Tenneri, which is to the north of Ullavur, which plays a very major role. This Palar river plays a very major role. There are canals from both of them linking to Ullavur. There are, of course, other water bodies everywhere. This is the Chengalpet, and somewhere beyond that side is Kanchipuram. Somewhere here is Uttarmeru. Okay. So this is Tirumukudal. This is the temple at Palai Sivaram. Tirumukudal, I am taking a photograph from here. And this is the Tenneri. This is what is called the Madag, from which water goes to the fields. There is something called Kalangal, which takes the overflow of the water, takes it to a channel to other areas. So this is the Maduvu. Okay. So in Chengalpet, for about 1900 localities, the average area of water bodies is about 13%. The cumulative area is 13% of the total land area. And there is 17% of forest, 2% of plantations. The habitation again is only 3%. Cultivable land is only about 48% in 1770s. So this system of areas is not just in Tamil Nadu. It's there in South India. It's there in Madhya Pradesh. It's there in Rajasthan. It's there in Gujarat. And its extraordinary factor, for instance, is documented by one Major Sankey, who looked at old Mysore state. And the old Mysore state, that is before 1956 state reorganization, 29,500 square miles had 38,000 of these areas, which are called keres in Karnataka. The main thing is these are a chain of tanks, that the overflow from one area goes to the another area, or to a river, or to another channel, then it goes to another area. And his main point was, these 38,000 are such that I cannot add one more tank, or I cannot close one tank without disturbing the efficiency of this entire system. Which means these areas actually, if you see that map itself, you will see something very funny. Most of these are curved towards the east. That is, the bund is only here. The rest of the place is where water collects because the land slopes from west to east. So the area is bunded only on one side. Other three sides, the natural topography ensures that the water stays there. And then the overflow goes to the next. So it was this wonderful understanding of the topography of the entire region. That is what makes that kind of a system possible. And that's what is being discussed by Major. So this was very local technology with a very global understanding of the environment which was done. And so even amongst the households, you see that only half of them were agriculturists, 14% are manufacturing people, artisans, about 6% are weavers, merchants 7%. Very interesting is that militia and police is about 3.5%. Today, police and militia in India are less than 1% of our population. So this agricultural production in Ullavur was about 4 tons per hectare and 12 tons per household, about 2 tons per capita. We'll come to it in a minute. So in this about 1,500 villages, the average productivity was about 2.2 metric tons per hectare. And the average production per household was about 5 metric tons per household. Usually the households were of 5 persons, and so what they had was about 1 metric tons per household per annum. 5 metric tons per household per annum, and they had a productivity of about 2.2. Today, India's productivity is slightly less than 2.5 metric tons per hectare, and what we have now is less than or around 1 metric ton per person. So, while knowing about this 18th century, we can see what progress we have achieved since independence. So, in 60s, you can see China, India, Asia all have reasonably similar productivities, about 0.7 ton per hectare, 0.9 ton per hectare, 0.9 ton per hectare. And availability of food also, India had about 181 kgs per person, China 147, Asia had 170. Now in the last 60 odd years, the trajectories have been reasonably or substantially different. Today we are able to, in fact, about 7-8 years ago, this figure would have been less than 2 tons. This is 2.4 tons, 2,399 kg per hectare. This is the productivity. And China is about 5.5. Asian average is 3.8. World average is 3.9. Similarly, availability of food grains, our availability today is about 220 kilograms. China 400, Asia 270, world average is 3. So, as a civilization, whether we catch up with the West or China or USA is immaterial, we have to catch up with our own civilizational potential that this land can give. That's the main point. So there are various important things about this other data here, which is that it is explaining a certain kind of what the British called as a village republic. So what does this village do? Whatever is produced is distributed, about 1/3 of that, or around 27-28% of it is distributed between various individuals, institutions in the village, and also between larger regions, individuals and institutions. So in this Ullavur, this was done in 4 stages. Before threshing the crop, after threshing, before measuring, and then after measuring. So the first stage would not even come to count as measured production. So every 4 tons per hectare, etc., would be after this, what is called this Swatantram is taken out. So this Swatantram in any village, it goes into 2 pages. It's about 8% in all of the produce that is distributed. So all these things are there: Peliyar Kovil, Perumal Kovil, Amman Temple, Dharmaraja Kovil, Panchangam Brahmin, Vishnu Brahmin, the temple servants, Idayar, cow-keepers, Kudumi, medicine man, potter, Kusavan, Tannir Kari, water person, Panisavan, village servant, washerman, barber, Bolikaran. Valluvan is a non-Brahmin priest of the Amman temple. And then what are called the original landholders of the village. They had about 0.5% of the. Then the agricultural servants, and then some Muslim functionaries also come. Then the militia chief, Palaikara, then the artisans, then the goldsmith come money sort of changer, Tamil teacher, that's very important, Kanakapillai, Alavakaran, Kambakati, the irrigation person. Like that it goes. So 8% is given, and that corresponds to about 81 tons in Ullavur's production. Then there is something called Merai, so which comes to 11% and 4%, which is given after the measuring the crop. So Merai and Swatantram together in Ullavur was about, this is about 16%, and that was about 8%, 24% of the produce. And here you can see the cultivator servants are getting a large share, but 4 regional temples are getting a share. Kanchipuram Varadaraja Swami temple, this Tirukkalikundram, that is Pakshitirtham Vedagirishwar temple, then this Singaperumal Koil and Tirukachiyur are on the opposite sides on the Chengalpettu Madras road, Marundishwara and Singaperumal. And then village temple, Kanungwa is a regional accountant, Deshmukh is also a regional administrator. The irrigation fund is very important. This is the Kanakapillai, Palaikara is the militia, again the goldsmith and the money changer, artisans. So these are the 4 great temples: Kanchipuram temple, this Tirukkalikundram temple, this Singaperumal temple, this the Marundishwara temple. So in these 2,000 villages, it's not only the village institutions which are taken care of, but what are called the large, great cultural centers are taken care of, and they are really mega centers from today's point of view. Kanchipuram Varadaraja Swami temple is getting 1% from 1,270 villages. This is a data for about 1,900 villages that I am discussing. The Singaperumal and Tirukachiyur are getting 451 and 448. Bhashyakara temple in Sri Perumbudur 400. Tirukkalikundram Vedagirishwar 338. Kumbakonam Chikkadiyar is the name for the Kanchi Kamakoti Peetham Matam, who had shifted in early 18th century or perhaps late 17th century to Kumbakonam. And similarly, Tiruvalikeni Tolasinga, that's the temple or the other side of the Parthasarathi temple, Tiruporur Kandaswamy, Tiruvalluvar. So what Nawab of Arcot could do was to add 3 Muslim places to this: Kovalam Dargah, Salapaka Mullah Sahib, and Santom Pirzada. This was the old Indian system where the village assigned about 30% of the produce within the village, which makes it a republic, of course. But it also takes care of that 30% had a 20% within the village, 10% was intra-village for the larger region. And that took care of all the great cultural centers. And if you look up carefully the gazetteers of 19th century, you can look at what this is in Changalpet. You will see as very similar systems in all districts of South India, that there will be about 40-50 major temples which are getting a share, which the British stop and give some equivalent in money, and then it decays and almost becomes negligible. Okay, amongst the Indian sort of thinkers, it's Mahatma Gandhi who had a very clear idea of this. It's because of this that he was talking of Gram Swaraj. And he tried to explain this Gram Swaraj in an article written just about 3-4 months before the Constituent Assembly of India started debating the future polity of India. So he is saying that every village should be a republic, and so every village should be self-sustained, capable of managing it, even defending it against the whole world, etc. But equally important is, in this does not exclude help from neighbors, etc. In this structure composed of innumerable villages, there will be ever widening, never ascending circles. Life will not be a pyramid with the apex sustained by the bottom, but it will be an oceanic circle whose center will be the individual and the village, the later for the circle of villages. So this idea that the village sustains its region and the region sustains the village back, the region sustains the larger region, is the kind of polity that was discussed. Then there's a system of education that was prevalent, since we are in an educational institution. So a survey was conducted in Madras Presidency in 1820s. So they found about 1,53,000 boys were studying in what are called the primary schools of that time. And the population was about 1.2 crores. So this would mean about 25% of boys of school-going age attending these schools. But apart from that, there were a large number of children who were being instructed at home by teachers. Now, amongst the people who are going to these schools, they asked for the caste composition, but on the basis of this Varna categories. So the Shudras and the other castes, which is a sort of a name for the communities which today we call as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, they constituted about 65% of the total students. And in Tamil area, it was about 76% of the total students who were in this category. It's not, if you go to Malabar, you see higher education, that there is astronomy taught. And again, over 800 students are studying. The Malabar is the equivalent of northern Kerala today, the districts above Palghat. And similarly, medicine is studied by 200 scholars. Both men and women are there in this. Even surveys were conducted in North India by William Adam. And he sort of takes 5 districts and makes a survey of both elementary education, higher education. And the main thing that his tabulation shows is, it's not just Mimamsa, Sankhya, Veda which are studied. Amongst the subjects studied in these higher institutions of higher learning is Vyakarana, Nyaya, Dharmashastra, literature, astronomy, Kosha, etc. So, this was the kind of higher education. There is a very detailed documentation done by Adam. More interesting than that is this place called Navadvipa, called Nadia now. So, William Jones, when he went there, he says, this is the 3rd university that I am encountering. And here, in this Navadvipa, at that time, this 1791, in an article in Calcutta Monthly Register, what it is saying is, there were 1,100 students and 50 teachers. And they say 100 years earlier, there were 4,000 students and teachers in proportion, which means about 4 times this 150 teachers, about 600 teachers. And by 1830, it had come down to 500 students with 25 teachers. So a lot of teachers being together in a place is what would have given the impression of the university. And we all know this, that Macaulay said that all this education is not worth teaching. We should decide whether we want to teach well-established sciences or we want to teach medical doctrines which would disgrace an English farrier. Farrier is a horse doctor, I think. astronomy which would move laughter in girls at an English boarding school. Anyway, that's Macaulay's language. And he also says natives are desirous to be taught in English and are not desirous to be taught Sanskrit or Arabic. This is in 1835, about 60 years after Bengal has been subjugated. And there has been in 1771 a very major famine which sort of wiped out about 1/3 of the population. So the situation of the society is really in rather very pitiable condition. And 60 years of British rule, even great nationalists like Rajaram Mohan Rai thought that the deliverance of India from this situation would be by learning the mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, and not learning anything about Sanskrit language or Vyakaran or Nyaya. And in fact, he goes about to say that Sanskrit system of education would be best calculated to keep this country in darkness. So even a great patriot, a great sort of scholar of Vedanta, etc., had been reduced to this kind of situation. And anyway, so there's a great revival of India also. This Ayurvedic system of medicine was sort of banned for public practice. There will be no government hospital which will take a doctor of indigenous medicine. But there was a great revival from second half of 19th century. All this Kottakkal College, Dabur Company, Madras Ayurvedic College in 1905. First, there is a sort of Ayurvedic physicians forum associations and movements. And Mahatma Gandhi in his Hind Swaraj has a very trenchant critique of modern Western medicine, both from a moral and from a medical point of view. Then Banaras Hindu University sets up departments, Baidyanath Bhavan, Zandu Chemicals. Then Indian National Congress in 1920 declares that indigenous systems of medicine will be made national systems once India comes to independence, etc. And various other colleges are set up once these what are called the regional governments pass into Congress hands under diarchy. So Kilpauk College was established here as an Ayurvedic college in 1925. Now it's a completely a college of modern Western medicine. Anyway, so much has happened since then. So just to give you where we are in some sort of perspective. So even in 1991, modern Western medicine and Ayurveda had somewhat similar situation in India. There were about 4 lakh modern Western medicine practitioners, 3.4 lakhs of Ayurveda. The number of colleges was 146 and 109. The number of UG, PG students was about 12,000 and 4,000. But there has been a great divergence after that. So, of course, there are today 4 lakh Ayurvedic practitioners, and together with about 3 lakh of homeopathy and about 50,000 of Unani, we have about 7 to 8 lakh of Ayush, what is called the Ayush system, or what is called the Indian systems of medicine. Now, today we have about 731 modern Western medicine colleges with 385 in the government, run by government. But about Ayurveda, it's much more private, 540 total with only about 100 government colleges. So this is the kind of divergence which has happened. And much of it is due to this last, because many surveys say that our people, 60% of our people go for indigenous systems of medicine. Even last month or 2 months ago, there was a survey which said 45% of people in urban area do get an indigenous medical practitioner, but only 40% of them in the rural areas have an indigenous medical practitioner. But now this health ministry has an annual budget of 36,000. 10 years ago, now it's 90,000. This Ayush was a department then, it is now a ministry, but that has only increased proportionally without any major sort of change. So these are the kind of policies we have to carefully see how to strengthen our Indian knowledge traditions in the modern context. So what is the way forward? I have just tried to give a overall summary of some glimpses of what has happened through history. So first part is we have to do something about the sources of Indian knowledge traditions. As I said, we still do not have a full knowledge, or we have not fully rediscovered our own knowledge traditions seriously, systematically. Now there are all these sources. There are manuscripts, published works, inscriptions, archival records, material objects, then living practices of our people itself, then modern studies in terms of books, dissertations, and all that. So in this, these first three are very important. So there are about 10 million according to National Manuscript Mission. Most of it are in India, and about 80% are in Sanskrit. But only about 5% in each discipline are sort of published as books. So rest are all still in various manuscript libraries, in various scripts which most of us don't learn, and of course they are in our own languages. Published works, from these manuscripts, perhaps we have printed maybe 2 to 3 lakh books, or maybe something more than that. But what happens is, most of them are in the libraries, and we have not looked at those books with trying to understand what is their technical content. The scholars would have edited them 100 years ago, 150 years ago, or 30 years ago. A great Sanskrit scholar would have edited them. But there are no students, there are no researchers who are looking at these books, trying to understand their content, maybe translate them, or at least summarize the content. So that has to happen. So many of the discoveries that I talked about, the Dhruva, which was there in 2800 BCE, was in Taittiriya Aranyaka. It was known to everybody, but it's known to modern India only when somebody writes a paper on it in 2011. So this will be the kind of situation that we face in most subjects. Then these inscriptions, there are more than 1 lakh, many of them 80,000 are in South India. They have been collected by archaeological survey. Only about 15% have been published, and I think only 5% have been translated. So things like this, the archival records on the basis of which I discussed all this education system of 19th century, or this Barnard survey of 19th century, they are all archival records. One of the greatest scholars, Gandhian thinkers, Sri Dharampal was the person who did the sort of extraordinary amount of work on that. Whatever I am saying has been only a slight outgrowth of all that. Then similarly, there are iron objects, there are forts, there are even these areas. We need to look at all of them technologically to understand how they were done. And of course, living practices of our communities are even more important, because they are a civilizational resource of today on which we are talking of the skills, etc. We need to know what is the traditional skill and wisdom that our people have. For that, we have to have an empathetic mind to know it, not go and lecture them that you do not know anything and we are telling you. And finally, it is true that for the past 200 years, there is a huge Indological scholarship of the West in 19th century, and a lot of modern studies. But it is these sources that establish or reject what is written in this modern studies. So if Max Muller's translation is there, or today there is a translation by an American scholar, we have to put them against the rest of our knowledge traditions to see how faithful, how meaningful they are, because they do come from a very different background with a very different understanding of how ancient, especially Indian texts, have to be studied. So this is one side, that we have to do all these studies, and so our institutions of higher learning, colleges, will have to get down to a part of this at least. But equally important is we have to teach them. So we have to teach the fundamentals of Indian civilization, its worldview, our idea of oneness of creation, Indian values, all that is very important. But every student should be equipped with modern knowledge, and at the same time with knowledge and skills of corresponding disciplines as enshrined in the extensive corpus of India. As Professor Shriram said, there is this NPTEL course on the web of 40 lectures, Development of Indian Mathematics from Ancient Times to Modern Period. It gives an outline of Indian mathematics in a level of first year BSc or something like that, which any student will know how these ideas have developed. It's not just so-and-so was in such and such a century and he was in such and such a place, which is also important. But what is the mathematics content, and how did that person arrive at whatever algorithm or development or a result that has been produced in his book. So it is such graduate students and scholars who are well-versed both in modern and traditional Indian knowledge and skills of their discipline, and who are deeply conversant with foundational principles and knowledge of Indian civilization, who will be able to help in a significant way in the development of a self-confident, resurgent India and the creation of a new world order also. Much of it may not make sense to you immediately, But if you happen to see these slides later, after 6 months or a year, maybe after reflections, you will get some idea of where to look for the contours of Indian knowledge traditions and what we could really learn from them today for our contemporary. I thank the authorities of the college for giving me this great opportunity to address you, especially Madam and her teaching staff, who did that film about a person whom I don't know, but that is there. So, but these are really things that all of us should remember and think about. Thank you very much once again.